January is National Human Trafficking Prevention Month, and a transportation official in the Heartland are calling on you to help them spot instances of trafficking. Now, the most recent data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline shows there were more than 500 victims identified in Missouri in 2024. According to MoDOT, places like rest stops, gas stations, convenience stores, fast food restaurants and hotels are common areas for human trafficking to take place. I spoke with Heather Lubert in the Highway Safety and Traffic Division about the signs to look for.
Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to spend time to talk with us about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you taking the time to talk about this subject.
So the first question I do have for you is, how would you describe the issue of human trafficking in Missouri? Is it growing, would you say?
Honestly, that's a very hard question to answer. We do have data available to us from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and that data alone is indicating that there were a higher number of tips and calls submitted to the hotline in 2024, which is unfortunately the latest data that we have available. So more tips and calls were submitted to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, resulting in a higher number of cases involving a higher number of victims specifically within Missouri. So, does that mean that it is a growing problem? That's hard to say. It may be just that more education, more awareness is occurring and more tips are going reported as compared to prior.
Now, how does this issue spread, or kind of what methods do the people running these rings use to kind of get away with what they're doing?
So traffickers seek to exploit people's vulnerabilities. And while anyone can become a victim, there are certain groups that traffickers target at higher rates, but they're going to tend to make their victim feel special, essentially manipulate them to build their trust and dependency. And they want to exploit those vulnerabilities, identify what those people are seeking, what they may be lacking within their own lives, and make sure that they're filling those voids so that they can build that trust, build that dependency, and create that trafficking situation.
And what is it that MoDOT is doing? What is it that you guys are doing to fight it?
So for a number of years, we've been doing training with our employees, making sure that our employees understand what human trafficking really is, because there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about human trafficking. So we want them to understand what it truly is.
The last question that I have, so when we're talking about the signs, kind of what should an average person kind of look out for?
So there are numerous different signs that somebody may be human trafficked. They're kind of broken into groups. There's physical warning signs, there's emotional warning signs, and then there's also behavioral warning signs. And some of them are going to be easier than others to spot. And there may be one sign, there may be multiple signs. You just have to really look at the totality of the circumstances and the environment that you're in to really identify what you might be seeing. So from a perspective of the physical warning signs, we do know that not all traffickers will resort to physical violence, but if they do, there's usually signs of malnourishment, burn marks, bruising, cuts, signs of torture or restraint of some sort. They may still even brand their victims with some tattooing symbolizing money or property. It could also display in the clothing that's being worn by the suspected victim. They may be dressed inappropriately for the location that they're in, or the weather for that particular day, or they may just not even feel comfortable within that clothing. And those that could also be another sign from a physical standpoint. Also, if you're in a location where like money or identification would be exchanged, like a gas station or a grocery store, or a restaurant, hotel, airport of some sort, and that individual seems capable of being able to possess their own money or their own identification, but they're not able to actually do that, and somebody else is taking care of those transactions on their behalf, that may be indicative of a trafficking situation in which there is some physical control occurring between the two individuals as well.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this critical topic about human trafficking in Missouri. We do appreciate you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.